We're stepping a little bit away from expanded universe material and instead looking at real-world principles of dogfighting and of course evidence from the Star Wars movies to fully evaluate the TIE Fighter on today's Star Wars video. Let's roll the intro. When you look at discussions comparing the starfighters of the Rebel Alliance and the Empire, nearly all seem to agree that the X-Wing is far superior in nearly every way than the standard TIE. You also see this reflected in EU material and games where a single X-Wing squadron, even against overwhelming odds, will often leave the battle with dozens if not hundreds of kills while only suffering single-digit losses. Yet, if you only consider the hard canon of the movies as well as extrapolating real-world logic, I believe that the TIE Fighter is actually a pretty sensible design for its role. And let's talk about that role. Both the X-Wing and the TIE Fighter are classified as space superiority fighters. However, their actual role in each navy is very different. The X-Wing is primarily a multi-role strike fighter with its hyperdrive, shields, and capability for a heavy payload. The Rebels used it for hit-and-run attacks on unsuspecting Imperial targets since they didn't have the numbers to sustain pure attrition losses. The TIE Fighter, despite its name, is actually more of an interceptor. It was primarily tasked with protecting larger Imperial ships, and so its design is optimized specifically for anti-starfighter missions. You can see this in its armament, speed, and design priorities, which we'll get into now. The X-Wing has 4 lasers. The TIE Fighter has 2. Obviously 2 is inferior to 4, right? Well, maybe not. If we're looking at what the movies actually show us, and for a second, just think, are TIE Fighters and X-Wings really portrayed that much differently? We get the following. TIE Fighters shoot about 1 to 2/3 a shot per frame, while X-Wings in fact only shoot 1 shot every 2 frames. This was consistent between multiple scenes during the Battle of Yavin. So in other words, the X-Wing, despite having 4 separate laser cannons, fires each one more slowly than the TIE, which fires in bursts of 2 shots at a time. Therefore, going off movie logic, the TIE actually spits out more laser bolts in a given period than the X-Wing, despite having fewer cannons. Additionally, TIE lasers have another advantage. They're centrally aligned with the cockpit, which in the real world is highly desirable in terms of accuracy. If you've played, say, Mech Warrior Online or the old X-Wing games, you'll know how difficult it can be to set laser converging points and how it can be a real hindrance in terms of dogfighting. Convergence was also an issue for World War II fighters, which angled their cannons inward at a set distance to try to put more bullets in the same grouping. So it's safe to assume that in addition to having a faster firing rate, the TIE lasers are also more accurate and would have more shots on target. Going into Star Wars Expanded Universe material, we do see that X-Wing lasers do have one advantage. They can alter their fire, but even within the movies, we do see another big advantage of the X-Wing, and that is a secondary armament in form of missiles or torpedoes. Torpedoes, especially the kind we see in Episode 4, would be too slow, too expensive, and just too unwieldy to really use reliably against most starfighters. They're more an anti-capital ship weapon. Something like missiles would be more functional in a dogfight, but it's hard to say how frequently these would have been carried. Let's talk next about shields, and there's no question that TIE Fighters are less durable than X-Wings due to the lack of shielding. However, again, looking at the evidence from the movies, there's not a whole lot of evidence showing that shields are effective against anything other than a glancing blow. In A New Hope, Return of the Jedi, and Rogue One, we see that no fighters can withstand more than 3 to 4 direct starfighter laser hits, and a single turbo laser will take them down, regardless of shield systems. Furthermore, every time an X-Wing is hit but survives, it either suffers noticeable damage, like when Luke needs R2 to repair his engine, or when Wedge has to bail in the trench run, or the fighter loses control long enough for it to crash into nearby terrain. Therefore, the on-screen evidence is that shields seem more to blunt the damage of weaponry than deflect it entirely. Again, this is an on-screen thing, and in contrast to the video games, movies, books, etc., where X-Wings are flying tanks capable of absorbing dozens of direct hits without even flinching. Moving on though, let's talk about hyperdrive. One of the X-Wing's main strengths comes from its integrated hyperdrive system, allowing it to jump in, take out its targets, and leave before things get too dicey. The TIE Fighter doesn't have this function, but it doesn't need it. Most offensive operations under the Empire are done with brute force, and especially the use of Imperial capital ships. We do see TIEs doing things like patrolling space or protecting capital ships, but those kind of maneuvers don't actually need hyperdrive. Let's talk about maneuverability and speed. In virtually every source material, the TIE fighter is significantly faster and more agile than its rebel counterpart. In the almost exclusively knife fight range of Star Wars dogfights, combined with the very low time to kill, even with shields equipped, this should probably be the top priority for every starfighter design. To be fair, however, I would note that on screen, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference in the perceived maneuverability of any ship, especially early on in Star Wars. The Y-Wing, the X-Wing, the TIE fighter all behave quite similarly, with maybe the TIE fighter getting a little bump because of how quickly they're able to pursue the rebel ships down the trench run. As an aside, we all know the thematic and visual similarities between Star Wars and World War II dogfights. One of the classic matchups of World War II was the agile but fragile Japanese fighters pitted against the slower but more durable American fighters in the Pacific. Despite having the reputation of falling apart with just a few direct hits, the capability of the Zero to outperform and outturn the American fighters was to such a degree that the official protocol eventually became simply avoiding close-range dogfights if possible. While certain maneuvers were eventually developed to counter the Zero to take advantage of its atmospheric limitations, especially in certain dive and high-speed conditions, these principles do not apply in space. Or, well, they might. Let's be honest, Star Wars is pretty inconsistent with how it treats the idea of a vacuum. Nonetheless, one of the main ways the Americans countered the Zero was through pilot attrition, which obviously is not going to be a tactic available to the Rebel Alliance, which itself is a far smaller military force. Let's talk about logistics, and one thing that a lot of Star Wars fans say, including myself, is that TIE fighters were cheap, disposable, and often relied on overwhelming numbers. It is true that TIE fighters were often deployed in larger numbers than X-Wings, but this was also largely because they were almost always deployed from some sort of carrier, and that the Empire simply had far more resources than the Rebels did. They certainly were cheaper to produce, but in addition, TIEs are often described as having few moving parts with an efficient and highly reliable propulsion system. This is a huge benefit for a navy the size of the Empire, which has to spread its forces across vast territories in the galaxy. As a result, TIEs aren't necessarily cheap so much as they are cost-effective and optimized in their purpose. Their numbers were an advantage and not a crutch. Let's talk about on-screen performance again, because this is what this video is largely about. In A New Hope, we see only 9 TIEs deployed in a defense against the Rebels. While there were likely more off-screen, they were definitely far from the overwhelming numbers that we would see in later films and media, like in Rogue One. Despite this, the TIEs did have a very favorable kill-death ratio, with their superior speed being key to the interception of Rebel fighters in the trench. Arguably, this isn't quite a fair matchup, as the X-Wings were racing towards a target and simply trying to survive, but I think it is worth noting just how effective the TIEs are in the first movie. Likewise, in Rogue One, there were more X-Wings destroyed by TIEs than vice versa, at least on screen, but the TIEs certainly don't seem as outright cannon fire aside from the epic actions of a few Rebel heroes. Return of the Jedi also shows several Rebel losses to TIE fighters. Interestingly, one area where we do see TIE attrition is during the Death Star trench run, or rather the internal run of the Death Star 2. Maybe the Imperial Flight Academy wasn't quite as prestigious as we thought, but there's a few miscellaneous aspects of the TIE I'd like to cover to finish off the video. First, let's talk its lack of life support. While cutting life support seems like a simple cost-cutting decision, it actually does make sense since the suit seems to serve the purpose of the spacecraft quite well. Even in the Rebel fighters, the flight suit is a backup in case the cockpit is compromised. We also see in Star Wars Rebels, for example, that the cockpit does have oxygen and pressure. It's possible that the TIE simply lacks the means of refreshing air within the cabin. Secondly, the TIE fighter does have an ejection seat, despite what some believe. This, combined with the already sealed flight suit, would help increase the pilot's chances of survival outside of atmosphere. Finally, anyone who's played Star Wars Squadrons, like myself, the Baron of Operation Ace, knows the TIE viewport is exceptionally tiny. In fact, even though EU material material describes the intersector wing cutouts as improving visibility, the tiny window actually means that the pilot sees even less, since the tie windows are not even visible from the pilot's narrow field of view. Interestingly, in the old Star Wars cross sections, Stormtrooper helmets are described as having built-in HUD for targeting assists. We also see the pilots in A New Hope trench run looking to his side when Han arrives, which would have been blocked by his cabin wall and, of course, the tie's wing. It's possible that the pilot's helmet has some sort of sensor or radar overlay to assist the pilot with visibility, as we see on the F-35 in the real world, for example, but this has not yet been confirmed anywhere in canon. So to conclude, the X-Wing is still a great fighter, but it's more a jack-of-all-trades ship that's very well suited to Rebel hit and fade tactics. If we look at the TIE Fighter on the other hand and take its on-screen feats, it's arguably a better dogfighter and interceptor, but limited in the missions that it can undertake effectively. Its strengths, namely its agility, is largely due to the absence of equipment such as shields, warheads, and hyperdrives, which would only be a burden to it in dogfights. Later in the war, even Rebel A-Wings would adopt this line of thought, as they took only the most basic shields and armor in exchange for speed. Ultimately, both ships were great for the respective needs of their faction, and I don't mean to detract from anyone's perspective of this matchup, but the iconic TIE Fighter deserves some praise, and a lot of people, myself included, have been a little too harsh on it in the past. All of this also only serves to make Rebel X-Wings even more heroic. They were not only going up against a numerically superior foe, but also one that was very capable in its own right. But guys, that's all I have for today. I want to give a massive thank you to I'm Drunk on Tea for helping me with this script. You can find their Twitter and ArtStation down in the links below. I really think they helped bring something completely different to this video, a new perspective. So if you'd like to see them contribute more to the channel, maybe let me know in the comments. Until next time, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.